I started noticing it because it was always the same move. A pause, a smile, and then my colleague would repeat my point like it was his. If I corrected him, he'd tilt his head and make it sound like I was confused. It was subtle enough to deny, but loud enough to sting. I work on a small analytics team at a mid-sized company, the kind of place where everyone pretends meetings are collaborative, but the same three voices do most of the talking. I'm not new, and I'm not shy about details. I'm the person who catches the missing zero before it goes to the CFO. My colleague, Dan, joined about a year ago. Friendly at first, eager, always volunteering to take the lead on updates. The problem wasn't that he was ambitious. The problem was that he treated my competence like a threat he had to manage. The first time I felt it, we were in a project status meeting with product and finance. I explained why a metric spike was artificial, an API retry loop, not real usage. Dan waited exactly long enough for the room to absorb what I said, then jumped in with, "Right, so what she means is, the data isn't reliable, and we shouldn't trust it." That wasn't what I meant. I opened my mouth to clarify. Dan smiled, shrugged, and added, "We can circle back later if you want to get into the weeds." Everyone laughed politely. I sat there with that hot, embarrassed feeling you get when you realize you've been framed as the fussy one. I told myself it was a one-off. Then it happened again, and again. He would translate my explanations into oversimplified nonsense, then act like I was being difficult if I corrected him. In hindsight, the pattern was almost too clean. Escalation number 1 came in the form of a shared slide deck. I opened it the morning of a leadership review and saw my charts relabeled. Not wrong exactly, but vague enough that the story changed. The axis notes I'd added were deleted. A footnote about an exclusion rule was gone. When I messaged Dan, he replied, "Tightened it up. Leaders don't like caveats." That afternoon, our VP asked why the numbers didn't match the dashboard. Dan answered before I could, confidently, with an explanation that sounded plausible if you didn't know how anything worked. I corrected him gently, because I still thought professionalism would win. Dan chuckled and said, "Yeah, that's one way to look at it." I watched the VP's expression shift, just slightly, from curiosity to doubt, aimed at me. Escalation number 2 was worse because it got personal. After a meeting where Dan steamrolled me, a coworker I trusted pulled me aside and said, "Hey, just so you know, Dan's been telling people you get territorial about the data." Territorial. Like I was hoarding information, not doing my job. I started replaying moments in my head. The way he'd ask me questions in Slack that were clearly bait, then screenshot my answer and paste it into another channel without context. The way he'd volunteer me for tasks in meetings, but phrase it like I needed the structure. The way he'd act surprised when I knew something. Escalation number 3 came when I found an email thread I wasn't supposed to be on. I'd been added accidentally as a CC, then removed, but not before I saw the subject line, "Ownership of reporting stream." Dan was pitching our director on why he should own the narrative for the next quarter. He wrote, and I still remember this line, "We need a single throat to choke for reporting consistency." He didn't name me, but he didn't have to. In that moment it clicked. This wasn't clumsy communication. It was positioning. I realized something else too. Dan's confidence wasn't backed by understanding. He leaned on me, on my corrections, my caveats, my quiet fixes, to keep him from stepping on a landmine. He could grandstand because I kept catching the falling plates. So I stopped, not in a dramatic, scorched earth way. I didn't announce it. I just started letting his small errors sit there in the open air. The first test was a weekly forecast meeting. Dan presented a chart and claimed churn was down because new onboarding is working. I could see instantly that he'd filtered out enterprise clients by accident. Normally, I'd jump in and save the narrative before it spread. This time, I asked one question. Which segment is that filtered to? Dan didn't answer. He squinted at the slide like it might change if he stared harder. "It's overall," he said. I nodded slowly and said, "Okay." Then I let the silence do its job. After the meeting, he messaged me. "Hey, can you double-check that churn chart? Something seems off." I replied, "Happy to look if you send me the query you used." He didn't. The second test came 2 weeks later in front of senior leadership. Dan insisted we were tracking month-over-month growth, when his numbers were actually week-over-week, rolling. The difference wasn't minor. It made us look like we were accelerating. I watched him talk faster, louder, the way people do when they're trying to outrun a mistake. I watched our CFO ask, very calmly, "Can you walk me through the calculation?" Dan stumbled. He clicked through backup slides that didn't exist. He started to say my name, like he could toss the ball to me. I kept my face neutral and said, "I didn't build that view." It wasn't petty. It was true. The room shifted, not dramatically, but enough. People began asking him questions instead of nodding along. The meeting ended with a request for a revised report by end of day, and Dan looked like he'd swallowed a paperclip. The turning point happened the next morning when my director asked for a private chat. She didn't accuse me. She asked, "Has Dan been editing your work?" That question told me everything. Someone else had finally noticed the mismatch between my usual precision and the sloppy confidence Dan had been selling. I showed her versions of the deck. The missing footnotes. The Slack screenshots without context. The email subject line. I kept it factual, because facts are my comfort zone. My director leaned back, exhaled, and said, "I had a feeling. He's been framing your attention to detail as obstruction." Apparently, Dan had been angling for a promotion tied to leadership presence. He thought if he could make me look like the anxious technician, he'd be the polished storyteller. The underlying reason was painfully simple: there was only one promotion slot. By the end of that week, reporting ownership was reassigned. Dan was told he'd be contributing, not leading, until his work could stand on its own. I wasn't made a manager, but I was given direct review control over anything with my data on it, and my director started asking me to present my own findings. Dan still sits in meetings. He still smiles. But he doesn't correct me anymore, and he doesn't translate my words. He takes notes. I didn't win by being louder. I won by refusing to be his safety net, and it turns out the ground under him was never as solid as he pretended.